So for my project, I decided to choose the second option, which was a program to foster tolerance. And I decided to kind of go with, oh, I decided to go with the community park, a community park book club for kids. Um, and I kind of got my inspiration for this from No Name, uh, also full name Fatima Naima Warner. And No Name is a rapper, a poet, an activist, a producer. And I've followed No Name for a long time on Twitter and just in general, listening to her music. And she runs this book club. It's called No Name Book Club. And headquarters is in LA. And recently, I think I went in December, I went and I visited the book club, and I was able to partake in the discussion. And I wasn't necessarily reading the book, but you don't have to have read the book to come and, participate in the discussion, because it's just a really like interesting discussion about different parts of the book, but also just like a more general, um, you know, kind of discussion where anyone can jump in and offer some opinions. But I liked the concept, and I like that it's kind of a space where people have access to free, unlimited educational materials. And I visited the bookstore and I saw so many books, and I was able to kind of like look around, and I saw so many Black and Indigenous authors and other people of color that were, in their books that were in the bookstore. And I just like the idea of coming in. We were all kind of situated in a circle and just able to like talk and unpack, specifically that book at the time, but just kind of unpack our thoughts about all different kinds of topics. And I just thought the space that No Name kind of created, and she has so many different, there's a lot of, they do it in many cities, but LA just happens to be the headquarters. But I just really like admired the space that she created at her book club. And I just wanted to kind of emulate something like that with my project. So the general concept behind my project would be to have a club where children would be able to come to the park and kind of just read books, pre-chosen books for the children to read, but books that kind of just introduce them to the importance of thinking critically about race. And I think these kind of discussions will be super important to, kind of fostering a generation of people that are a lot more aware of their place in society, and willing to take action against a system that upholds white supremacy. So, I don't think that many children have access to resources that can expand their thinking about how race, law, and society intersect in this country. So I think having a space where kids of different backgrounds can kind of just come together and have an enriching discussion, and share with each other and work through analyzing their differences. I think that would be really great, because then they could also find common ground and hopefully friendship. So I think that's kind of the whole point of what I was trying to do. And the most important thing I wanted to just talk about is like critical race theory, which a lot of people, there's a lot of critics against it, but critical race theory is basically something that the term was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, but the idea of critical race theory definitely came before this specific term was coined. But it was apparent to Professor Crenshaw that the racial inequality that persisted despite the efforts of civil rights activists and legislation during the 50s and 60s was not so easily dismantled. And Crenshaw, amongst other theorists at the time, Neil Gotanda and Stephanie Phillips, created a workshop in 1989. And the purpose of this workshop was to develop new tools and principles that could explain why. And they called this critical race theory. This was a framework that was created to address the need for a different approach to talking about intersectionality of race. The civil rights movement that happened just, only a few decades before, and all of the legislation and, the people that activists that were a part of that era, all the work that went into creating change for Black people and people of color more broadly during that time, was definitely completely valid, but they were still seeing that, not much had changed. Like, things had changed, but Black people were still essentially in the same position that they were in the civil rights, on a systemic level. So here's like kind of just the essential idea of what critical race theory is. It's kind of like, it's not one thing, but like, it's a central idea that racism is not just a product of individual bias or prejudice, but rather a systemic issue that's deeply embedded in our legal system, government policy, and social structure. So it's mainly concerned, like the theorists who are, proponents of critical race theory are mainly concerned with institutions and systems. It's not necessarily just like a good or bad person. It's like, you like simplifying it to that just kind of like diminishes what the system is perpetuating, in general. So you kind of have to look at it from a more broad spectrum than kind of looking at it from person to person. It's just kind of like that's kind of like the idea behind critical race theory. So next question would be, how will the book club foster tolerance? And I think having a book club like this would create a space for children to be respectfully curious and ask questions. I think children are just naturally curious. I mean, they're kind of like, especially younger children, and just, before the age of 18, your mind is growing so much and you have a thirst for knowledge. And even growing up as a child, I remember kids asking me all types of questions. But I don't think most children are taught how to respectfully be curious. I mean, I've gotten lots of upfront kind of crazy questions as a child that kind of caught me off guard and, hurt my feelings a little bit. But I kind of realized now that those kids were not given the tools, either at home or at school, to be able to, ask me those questions in a way that is more respectful. So I think having a book club like this, where children are learning about the differences between each other, and to be, respectfully conscious of those differences, will definitely help that. So the second thing would be promoting positive associations with children of different racial and ethnic identities. So I think a lot of the times, children, their ideas about different people are sometimes rooted in stereotypes and prejudice and bias and all that stuff. So I think, if they're able to think critically about race from a young age, I think that they would have different associations with different people that look and have different lived experiences than them, and more positive associations and less negative associations. So, and then the third thing would be helping students to feel valued and empowered. So this just applies to students of all backgrounds, just making sure that every child feels valued and feels, accepted in their environment, which is super important. And not every child feels that, especially in a school environment. I don't think that many schools or, many teachers sometimes are even prepared to address the needs of all of their individual students based on their environments that they're coming from. And I think students sometimes tend to feel looked over or or misunderstood. So I think a space like this would definitely help students to feel more valued and empowered. And then number 4 would be giving children the opportunity to learn about history through a lens that is not tainted by white supremacist ideals. I can definitely say before I got to college that I was learning about history in a way that I find really just repelling, just revolting. I really feel like just a strong passion for wanting to teach children history in a way that is more authentic and more honest, because I think a lot of the times our history classes are they brush over all of the things that they think children are maybe too young or to know about, or I guess is the logic behind it, or but I think knowledge is power, and I think that there'll be, a generation of people who are a lot more aware of the differences of people around them, and the people beyond the United States, all over the world, if they're learning about history through an honest lens that's not tainted by white supremacy. And then lastly, I just wanted to say, like, who are the biggest critics of critical race theory? And there are a lot of critics of critical race theory. And many of these critics believe that critical race theory is being used as this kind of like divisive tool to turn people of color against white people. And I don't think that this is true, because the theory says that racism is kind of like an everyday, is part of like your everyday life. So people, whether you're like white or non-white, who don't intend to be racist, can nevertheless make choices that fuel racism. So whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's still something that exists, and we have to be cognizant of it. But just to kind of touch on what's on this slide, as of March 27th of 2022, ABC News reported that 16 states have signed into law bills restricting education on race. And there are 19 states that are considering bills or policies that restrict race education. So there are a lot of people who don't want children to be thinking critically about race. And there's a reason for it. It's to uphold white supremacy. I mean, if people have this knowledge, if they know the truth, if they aren't getting a watered down version of history, then they'll be more likely to mobilize, more likely to want to seek out change, and I think that a lot of people don't want people to be loud, and don't want people to be angry, and don't want people to want things to change. So I think there's always going to be probably a lot of pushback against critical race theory, but it's important to have programs like this, and programs like what No Name is doing. I remember when I went back in December, I went with a friend of mine, and she brought her little cousin. I think her cousin was like 10 years old, 11 years old, and No Name sat aside and talked to her for a while. And my friend, who continued to go after, because she lives in LA and she's able to get to the book clubs a lot easier, she actually ended up telling her that she wanted to do something for kids because of her bringing her younger cousin. And just seeing how like there's different, like, so like my friend who brought her younger cousin was just so excited to be there and to be learning and partaking in these conversations. And I think children are a lot more resilient than I think lawmakers and just people in general believe. I think giving them this knowledge and teaching them these things is going to do a lot more good than bad for them. And that's kind of like my takeaway, but that's like, I think, the end of my presentation.